I want to talk for a few minutes about how to manage our potassium, sulfur, and then touch briefly on micronutrients as well. So with that, let's jump in. I wanted to start with talking about what Brian just talked about. Are there miracle cures that can substitute for proper fertilization? And I'm sure you've been approached with different opportunities, different products, different things that can be used. And they say this can replace so much of your fertilizer. And I wish that was true, but so far we haven't come up with any biologicals or any other materials that can replace fertilizer. That still plays an essential role. And so managing nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are still going to be key to profitability no matter what we do. There is no miracle cure. And I appreciate Brian and David both talking about that. I want to talk quickly about potash to start with and where potash comes from. All the potassium that we use comes from ancient seas or oceans that are either now buried, such as the potassium we mine from Canada, which may be a half a mile deep there on the left, or some of the potassium is still mined from surface brines, such as the Great Salt Lake, which you've probably seen as you drive by there. And this also includes the Dead Sea over in Jordan and Israel and other sources of potassium. So potassium is mined in many different places in the world and then transported to wherever it's needed. United States is not a major producer of potassium, although there are some potassium mines, the Great Salt Lake, out on the Utah Nevada border, a few other places, but we import most of the potassium that we use. So as we talk about using nutrients properly, it really comes down also to get the roots in shape so they can use those nutrients properly. So we can do everything right with the fertilization, but if we're not taking care of those forage roots, then those nutrients aren't going to be used efficiently. That can include diseases, poor nodulation, soil compaction, insects. If it's growing in very hot or very cold conditions, nutrient deficiencies, all those things that affect root health is going to affect how we recover those nutrients, those valuable and expensive nutrients that we're using. So as we go along this evening, I want to talk about how our management practices impact root health. As we're growing alfalfa in this example, we realize that when we harvest crops, we also remove a lot of potassium. For example, alfalfa in an 8-ton crop, we're removing about 480 pounds of K2O or fertilizer equivalent every year. So in an average alfalfa crop, we're removing about 60 pounds of K2O in every ton. So as Brian mentioned again, there is that balance. We can't harvest or remove nutrients indefinitely and not replace them. So that's where it gets tricky. Do we need potassium this year or don't we? And so we'll talk about why potassium is important, then we'll switch to sulfur, and then we're going to talk about how to assess the need to see if that gives you the economic benefit that you're looking for. But all crops remove a lot of potassium during harvest. Looking quickly at the potassium cycle, as Brian mentioned, there's a lot of potassium in most of our soils in the West. And I think when many of these farms were started maybe 100 years ago or more, they thought there is so much potassium there, we will never need to add potassium fertilizer. But increasingly, we're seeing that those mineral sources of potassium, those exchangeable sources of potassium, those potassium reserves that were present in the soil 100 years ago are getting slowly mined. And in many areas, we do see there is a response to potassium that we haven't seen 20 years ago or 50 years ago. So remember, all of these things have to become a soluble source of nutrient before the plants can take it up. So you can have a lot of potassium there in the rock, you can have it in the clay, you can have it in the minerals, but until it is dissolved, the roots can't take it up. And one thing that Brian teaches frequently is that plants drink their nutrients. And I appreciate that sort of analogy that things have to be soluble before they can be taken up by the root. So there can be a lot of potassium, as I mentioned, a lot in the minerals, in non-exchangeable sources, but only a very small amount in solution. And that's what we're trying to manage, is to make sure there's always adequate potassium there to meet the plant demand throughout the growing season. We won't skip over this, but you'll recall that potassium is found in many different forms. Exchangeable potassium on the clay minerals, and then also non-exchangeable potassium, which is locked in those interlayer regions, which is not available to crops. So when we do a soil test, we analyze what's exchangeable, what's on the surface of those clays, and we don't look at the non-exchangeable, the mineral forms of potassium, because those may not become available for years, for decades, or perhaps centuries. So those don't really tell us what's available to the plant in the short term. So there's many sources of potassium fertilizer. These are probably the most common ones: potassium chloride, potassium sulfate, the thiosulfate forms, the langbonite, which is sometimes sold as trio or KMag, potassium nitrates used in some of the specialty crops in particular. So when you're faced with this, you have to decide, well, which source do I use? And when you add these to soil, potassium chloride, sulfate, nitrate, you're adding in the KMag, potassium sulfate, potassium phosphate. Regardless of what potassium form you use, all the potassium is exactly identical, whether it comes from muriate of potash or it's coming from thiosulfate, the potassium is identical. I apologize, for some reason these graphics aren't showing up like they did a few minutes ago. But anyways, so if the potassium is the same in all these fertilizers, how do you decide which source to use? Well, it's not based on the K or the potassium, but it's based on the anion that comes along with that potassium fertilizer. So for some crops, you may want to avoid chloride. Some potato farmers in particular are adverse to using potassium chloride because it might have an effect on the specific gravity or the water content of the potato tuber. And so they might prefer potassium sulfate. Generally for alfalfa, muriate of potash or KCl is just fine, and at typical application rates, there's no problem with that. So you're not looking at the potassium when you're making these choices, you're looking at what comes along with the potassium. If you have need of sulfur, you might use the langbonite or the thiosulfate. So you look at the accompanying anion, and then of course you look at the price per pound of potassium. Potassium nitrate is quite expensive generally, and you wouldn't use that on alfalfa or most field crops. Well, let's quickly look at the role of potassium in plants. It's important for enzyme activation. We think of it often for water relations, for energy relations, and moving energy around in the plant. And it has an important role for stress resistance. So there's some fundamental things about potassium that just have to be there or the plant health is going to suffer. So to figure out if you need potassium, one, you can look at visual observations, and that is the method we don't recommend, because by the time you see visual symptoms such as this, that means you've already lost yield and quality. And so it may not be too late to fix it, but in the meantime, during that period of deficiency, the crop yield and quality have been suffering. Soil testing is good for many crops, and it's a little challenging for alfalfa sometimes, but in the chat just now, Gail was saying we should look at the soil before we plant the new stand of alfalfa, and then add the potassium, add the phosphorus, add the nutrients that are needed before you plant, and work them down into the root zone. And then finally, for all alfalfa growers, we recommend a regular tissue analysis program, so you can monitor what's going on and know that you're not losing yield and quality as the stand ages and over cuttings during the season. So if you're looking at visual symptoms, you may have seen this before, these yellow spots in the older leaves in particular. And we try to avoid seeing these things by sampling and staying ahead of the nutrient moderate potassium deficiencies, such as this. And then as it gets worse and worse, we have some of the severe potassium deficiencies that get really ugly, and the leaves start to fall off and the yields are quite poor. Potassium is important more than for just yield and quality. It helps with the plant persistence. It lives longer, the number of shoots per plant, and the yield. When potassium is deficient, you have less roots start storage, which means it doesn't survive the winter as well. You have less protein and you have poor growth. Just show that if you are low in potassium, you can have less nitrogen fixation. So the plants may look like they're becoming nitrogen deficient, but actually they could be potassium deficient. So a regular tissue testing program is essential to figure this out. The hay quality is improved with adequate potassium, leaf drop, leaf spot, getting more leaves compared to stems. All of those things are boosted with adequate potassium. I mentioned winter kill as well. When plants are deficient in potassium, they don't survive the winter as well because they're not storing the starch that they need. So just quickly to summarize that, alfalfa takes up a lot of potassium from the soil. And if you try to take shortcuts, you're going to lose your yield, your stem longevity, and winter hardiness. So recommend that you have a regular tissue testing program. Just quickly, as we finish this up, they asked to talk about sulfur briefly. And this also shows up increasingly as sulfur deficiencies are becoming much more common around North America. And actually, some of the older people in attendance may remember when we talked about acid rain back in the 70s and 80s. That acid rain was actually sulfuric acid being deposited on our agricultural fields and everywhere. And that came as a result of sulfur pollution from smokestacks, tailpipes, and lots of other emission sources. That sulfur has now been cleaned up from those fuel sources, and we no longer get that 10, 20, or 30 pounds of sulfur coming down in the rainfall that we did. So because we don't have that sulfur deposition occurring, we are now seeing more and more sulfur deficiencies. So we'll skip over this for time. Sulfur doesn't get as much attention as nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, but there's still a lot of sulfur that's taken up, especially by forage crops. You can see in alfalfa, in 8 tons of alfalfa, you're taking up about 50 pounds of sulfur, which may be equivalent or more than phosphorus you're taking out of the ground during harvest. So sulfur is one we shouldn't overlook. It's an important constituent of protein, which affects alfalfa quality. Again, it develops enzymes and vitamins. It's essential for nitrogen fixation, seed production, and chlorophyll. So it's taken up as in the form of sulfate. That's reduced to different amino acids, and that goes into a variety of different proteins. The sulfur deficiency looks at the leaves are spindly, the stalks just don't have many leaves on there, and then they also can start to look yellow, and it shows up first in the younger tissues of the plant. And then the entire plant starts to look sick and spindly. In canola and cabbage, 2 high sulfur demanding crops, the leaves actually start to look red. In alfalfa, the leaves get to be very slender and there's less branching on the plant. So here's some sulfur deficient alfalfa. Just quickly, some other sulfur deficient crops. Corn here. Some small grains. So sulfur is mostly found in organic matter in the soil. And 95% of the sulfur is in organic matter. So that means if your soil is low in organic matter, you generally don't have a big reserve of sulfur that can be available to the plant. The sulfur then needs to become mineralized by microbial decomposition, such as these little bacteria growing here. Those are actually chewing up the organic matter and releasing nitrogen that David talked about, and also releasing phosphorus that Brian talked about, and they also release sulfur. And this is the major source of sulfur in most of our soils. Plants take up sulfur in the form of sulfate, and sulfate is readily leached. So sulfur that's present in the soil today may be gone after the next rainstorm, since it's not attracted to the soil particles as the cations are. So the sulfate's going to just take right off. When we look at tissue testing's recommended soil testing is we're not as confident with the results of soil testing. So plant and tissue testing is really the best way to diagnose those problems. A lot of good sources of potassium when they're needed. Potassium sulfate is a good way to apply both potassium and sulfur. We talked about this langbonite mineral. Gypsum is also a very common one. It's less expensive. Takes a little while to dissolve sometimes. Elemental sulfur is also an excellent source of sulfur for crops. It does take time to go through this chemical reaction that's shown. This reaction occurs when the soils are warm, when they're moist, and when there's plenty of oxygen. This sulfur is then converted to sulfuric acid, and that sulfate is taken up by plants, and this acidifies the soils. This reaction may take days, months, years, depending largely on the particle size and then on the soil conditions. So broadcasting and mixing are generally the best way to put that on there. So we're converting elemental sulfur to sulfuric acid. And this is the least expensive way to apply sulfur. Just to summarize, sulfate is leached from the soil. So this is something you need to keep an eye on if you have low organic matter soils. So to wrap this up, there is no magic solution. We can't get high yields without having adequate nutrition. You can't get something for nothing. Remember this picture that I saw once of the perpetual motion car? No, that's not going to work either. We need to have the inputs there to have the outputs that we want. We've talked about the 4 R's, and that's fundamental to managing all of our nutrient sources. So in summary, measure what your soil can provide, consider your crop removal, set realistic yield goals. And for example, this work in Arizona where they harvested 24 tons of alfalfa per hay, that's not going to happen in most situations. So you need to have realistic yield goals. Use all the available nutrient sources, and we've talked about fertilizer and manure and organic matter today, and then keep a proper balance of all the nutrients, and then manage those crops for maximum economic yield, considering the price of fertilizer and the economic return from that extra yield. So I think, Matt, with that, we'll go ahead and stop there and see if there's some questions we can talk about, all right?